Welcome, everyone. I hope you're all well and safe. Thank you for joining us for today's event. My name is Safa Al-Wakili. I'm the events director of the Oxford Climate Society and a master's student here at Oxford in environmental change and management. Our society is part of Oxford University, and we aim to develop the next generation of informed climate leaders. In addition to our speaker events, we run educational programs throughout the year, including our School of Climate Change, which is now teaching over 1,500 people. We also run the world's largest student-led climate journal, the Anthroposphere, and we are currently working with the university to develop net zero policies and to incorporate climate into the Oxford curriculum. Today's event will discuss opportunities and barriers for a transition to a low carbon economy in the Gulf. The Gulf Cooperation Council countries' economic model relies heavily on fossil fuels, especially oil, as the main source of export and fiscal revenues. And the region's economic growth and political stability all fundamentally depend on a resource which is expected to lose commercial attractiveness and in the long run relevance in a decarbonizing world. And so effective global climate policies and low carbon technologies will likely reduce the demand for fossil fuels. According to the Carbon Brief, the world's demand for oil could fall by over 15% in the two following decades. And so the risk of fossil fuel exporting countries turning into stranded nations appears increasingly significant. And so today we would like to discuss how could these countries and these economies transition, diversify, but also reduce their energy intensity through the introduction and expansion of renewable energy. And so to discuss this, we are delighted to welcome two experts in the topic, Dr. Rabia Farouchi and Dr. Fouad Hassanov. Dr. Farouchi is the director of the Knowledge, Policy and Finance Center at the International Renewable Energy Agency, where she oversees the agency's work on a range of renewable energy policies, including design, socioeconomic benefits, and integrated resource management. Dr. Farouchi has over 20 years of experience working in different fields and with different sectors, public and private, including with the governments in MENA, Middle East and North Africa, energy companies in the Mediterranean regions, and the GCC and international institutions. Dr. Hassanov is a senior economist at the International Monetary Fund, and he's also an adjunct professor of economics at Georgetown University. Since joining the IMF in 2007, he has worked as an economist for several emerging countries and natural resource producers. And he is the co-editor with Reda Sharif and Minju of Breaking the Oil Spell, published in 2016, which examined economic diversification in all exporting countries. And so to start, I'll hand over to Dr. Farouchi to give her presentation.
Thank you so much, Safa, and thank you for this opportunity to present some of our insights at ARENA. ARENA is the International Renewable Energy Agency. We have about 164 member countries and the mandate of the organization is basically to support countries deploy further or greater shares of renewables. I think what we have been focusing most on over the past almost 10 years in the division that I lead is on ways to use basically the energy sector as a lever for a wider transformative recovery and pathways or development by highlighting the investment needs, providing evidence on the benefits of the energy transition, and recommending also policy measures for the energy transition. So I will focus mostly on the synergies that we can find between decarbonization and the energy transition through diversification, and mostly about the socioeconomic benefits that can accrue to different regions if they decide to start their transition early enough. Next slide, please. So basically, let me start by saying that very briefly on some of the positive energy transition trends. Annual capacity of renewable energy are really regularly outpacing those from conventional. So it's not a niche energy anymore. They've become increasingly competitive with fossil fuel in most contexts. That being said, of course, the pace of the transition is not sufficient enough to meet our climate goals. So we've been analyzing pathways, energy pathways to reduce energy-related CO2 emissions by mid-century. And we have different scenarios. The one that you see here is called the transforming energy scenario, where CO2 emission from the energy sector would decrease by about 70% from today, and keeping the temperature well below 2 degrees in line with the Paris agreements. Of course, half of these reductions, as you can see, would come from renewables, followed by around a quarter by energy efficiency. We're in the next few weeks publishing a 1.5 degree scenario pathways that have obviously greater ambition. Next slide, please. Just very quickly, you see that 2/3 of global power supply would have to come from renewables by 2050. And overall, the share of primary energy supply would need to rise quite a bit. Now, this wider adoption of renewables in the energy sector will really depend on the uptake of electricity for end-use applications. These are transport, heating, and cooling, as well as introduction. It's more and more that you will hear about is green hydrogen production. And of course, solar would be the dominant renewable energy source. Next slide, please. Now, this climate-safe future calls for the scale-up and redirection of investment to clean energies. Overall, we estimate investment in the energy system in this pathway that I showed you, that we need to reach about 110 trillion by 2050, and over 80% invested in renewables, energy efficiency, end-use electrification, power grids, and flexibility, etc. Now, 6% of these investment in our model are for the MENA region. This depends, of course, on the assumptions that you have about ambition pathways, etc. I think important to keep in mind is that the annual investment in renewable energy sector have averaged about 300 billion per year in recent years. They need basically to triple to 800 billion by 2050 to fulfill the global decarbonization goals. Next, please. As I said, a lot more is needed to achieve the climate goals. Within the power sector alone, the current national determined contributions, for example, deliver less than half of the required renewable power capacity. But as renewable energy technologies costs continue to drop, and the impacts of climate change become more evident if it's not enough. To date, countries and regions of the world will start increasing their clean energy ambitions. We have, as you saw in the last couple of few months, let's say, we have many countries announcing net zero strategies, including large economies like China, for example. Next. So in the GCC, there is the economic and social, let's say, rationale for the transition is strong enough and has been, at least in the discourse, present. Countries are trying to diversify their energy sectors, and mostly against the backdrop of growing domestic energy demand and a desire to safeguard future hydrocarbon export revenues. So renewables with energy efficiency can offer some of the solutions for diversification for the region. And the region is really blessed with solar and to some extent wind resources. And this combined with a regulatory environment, which I'll talk about a bit later, has really resulted in the past few years to some record level low prices in some of the projects that are being implemented, mainly through a measure that is we call auctions. Now, so you see that our targets in the slides are feature as part of the national energy plans, both across GCC and MENA also overall. And that to some extent they have been translated into some policies and regulation. Probably not enough, but we'll go into that in a minute. Next slide, please. I just want to briefly tell you that all the work that we do on the transition really towards a sustainable energy at the global scale not only contributes to climate goals, but can also have profound effect on the broad socioeconomic development. The scenario that we have shows the reduction of CO2 emission, as I just mentioned, but it also shows really how it drives higher GDP growth, more jobs, and improved welfare compared to what we have as planned trajectory from different governments. Of course, it should be highlighted that these are global numbers. We have also regional and country level to some extent. And some countries will fare much better than others, depending on country conditions, resource endowment, structure of the existing energy sector, obviously, ambition, means of ambition, etc. So these are just global figures that, of course, need greater granularity, which we cannot go into much today. So next slide, just to give you very briefly, this is how GDP grows globally, about 2% additional growth compared to the planned trajectory from governments, and with an annual amount of gains of about $98 trillion. Next slide. You see also that we have a welfare indicator that analyzes improvement through by incorporating economic, social, and environmental dimensions. And this improves quite a bit. As you know, GDP doesn't account for all the aspects that it needs to in terms of welfare. So this is quite impressive in terms of an improvement of 13%. Next one, yes. So basically what I want to show is through our model, we see that the transition-related energy jobs really lead the way. So you see all the numbers here in terms of renewables, energy efficiency, energy flexibility, which all expand well beyond the planned trajectory if you move through the energy transition. Next slide, please. Now, I'd like to just take 2 seconds, a little more on this, is the fact that we have looked at the employment opportunity along the segments of the value chains of renewables. We've done that for these technologies, as you see, PV, onshore, offshore. We have also solar water heater and CSP coming very close, very shortly. And this is to show the number of employment that you can get through the segment of the value chain, starting from project planning all the way to decommissioning. And policymakers need to really match skills demand and supply through active labor market policies. And when possible, create new job opportunities by leveraging existing local capacity. This came at the demand of member countries who wanted to know what they could gain other than deploying a specific project in these technologies. Of course, this being said, we need to have a transition, an energy transition that is as inclusive and just as possible. So, and the positive effects of these emerging employment opportunities must be spread equitably. So, because ultimately there misalignments will happen, at least in labor markets. We can talk about other things later, like happens in any major structural change in the economy. So as a result, you also need social protection measures for reskilling workers who lose or at least are at risk of losing employment, including obviously fossil fuel workers. And this is why the energy transition requires a broad set of policies, which I'll finish with in my conclusion. Next one. You see in the next one that for that same series that we did on renewable energy, segments of the value chain to localize as much as possible, you see that there can be a skill gap, and therefore you need to coordinate educational offerings with the needs of the industry. And this is why, as you were mentioning, Safa, that you're incorporating climate into your curricula. That's exactly it. How to incorporate them, how to do training, retraining, etc. One interesting point is that we find that there is a low-hanging fruit. So you do see skilled STEM, non-STEM, etc. But you also see that there is a low-hanging fruit with low qualified workers. So, for example, most jobs in construction and factory work do not require high degrees, etc. And then the greatest demand from the renewables is really in factory workers and technicians. So there's some skills that can be leveraged from other domestic industries with some retrainings, and this opens up not only employment opportunities for many people who don't have skills, but also synergies with certain other industries like offshore oil and gas, where you do find some synergies. Next one. Very briefly, Safa can share the slides with you. Here you have the jobs that the transition brings in the MENA region by 2050, by different technologies in renewable energy, but also along the segments of the value chain on the right. Next one, please. Overall, the benefits, as we know, emissions, a reduction, etc., diversification of energy supply, maybe focus on a high value export in the longer run, the diversification that many in the regions are integrating their strategy, local job creation and value added domestically. GDP remains constant, as you say, but I can explain that later. Welfare improves. There is a net addition of jobs because the creation of jobs in transition-related technologies. Again, this is renewable energy efficiency, flexibility, grid flexibility, etc. They outpace the loss of jobs that we find from fossil fuel and nuclear. Next, please. Overall, the benefits for the GCC, we have another report that looks at benefit in terms of also not only reduction in fossil fuel consumption, but obviously emissions, reduction in annual water withdrawal from the power sector, and the creation of jobs. So next slide. What is needed, however, I think that the main point I'd like to make here is that very often the energy transition is looked at from a very technology point of view. And even within my own organization, it took me a long time to ensure that we find an exercise, an analysis and an econometric exercise that really does not isolate the technology-oriented, let's say, the energy transition from the socioeconomic structures upon which it is built, or on which it is built. So from the energy policy point of view, there are already several policies that have been introduced in many countries. Some of them are direct policies, like which we call direct, which are deployment policies. You have many countries like Algeria, Egypt, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, etc., that are contracting actually solar and wind energy capacity through auctions. And they have resulted in very low prices, including for CEP in Morocco, or PV in the UAE, in Egypt, in Jordan, etc. Some countries are using local content requirements, such as Morocco, in their auctions in order to strengthen domestic value chains. Beginning last year, Tunisia introduced net metering. Elsewhere in the region, net metering has been used to support distributed solar production, for example. Then beyond these direct policies, you need also to have what we call integrating policies so that larger share of renewables can be supported by the system. And there is, for example, in Morocco, again, the country has made really headways with into thermal storage in the complex that's called the Ouarzazate solar complex to ensure that you can easily dispatch the solar generation. So there's also other examples. I'm not going to go into it, but beyond that, you also need some enabling policies to sort of bring together this ecosystem. And targets are, for example, a very important element that needs to be introduced, and many countries have done so for their energy sector, power sector in particular. Unfortunately, not so much other uses. And then some countries have also, like Algeria, Morocco, Tunisia, the UAE, renewable energy specific R&D centers. And all of that contributes, if you will, to the broader ecosystem required beyond the very direct policies that you usually hear about in the renewable energy sector. Next slide, please. Now, to really move towards a transformative decarbonization of societies, you really do need the sort of unwavering commitment of governments, the private sector, civil society. In our last report, which on post-COVID report, an agenda for recovery, resilience, and development, we have brought together some of these policies that are required in order to move faster and to maximize benefits. So you have some of them here, like raising ambitions, planning public intervention to reduce risk for private investors and strengthen markets, etc. At the same time, these policies must go hand in hand with the policies that I just mentioned, that are the energy specific policies. So with that energy policy ecosystem, you also need that broader enabling policies to maximize the benefit and to really address the systemic changes that are required. So as I mentioned, labor policies are one of them, education and training, support for R&D, collaboration between industry and research institutions, etc. And also, I think this is an important point, to minimize the cost of or the socioeconomic cost of this transition from fossil fuel, which requires, as I said, labor market and social protection policies to support workers in industries that may be rendered obsolete. That will be rendered obsolete, but at different pace, I guess. So my final slide is just a conclusion that, again, policies for the energy transition cannot be considered in isolation. They have to be viewed as part of the broader socioeconomic structures upon which this energy system is built and with which it interacts. So the systemic approach is required in the energy sector, of course. That's the ecosystem I spoke about, but also in the underlying socioeconomic system that we have built, and that has shown its limits. So as we're responding right now to this unprecedented crisis, we're reminded of the critical role of affordable and reliable energy, and the role it plays for sectors such as health. And we see really practical examples of how we can meet Sustainable Development Goal 7 and how it contributes to other SDGs. So as we try to build a better and maybe more inclusive and sustainable economy, we have to be conscious of this interaction between nature and our energy system. And it's probably the best time. It was an unexpected crisis, but maybe it's the best time that a lot of these packages, the green stimulus packages that have been approved to respond to the pandemic, is the opportunity to leverage basically on the socioeconomic benefits of the energy transition and overcome the current economic downturn, basically. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Dr. Farouki. That was a very interesting overview of the energy transition, which is hopefully underway. I'll just pass the floor to Dr. Hassanov for his presentation.
Thank you, Safa. Thank you for the invitation. It was a nice presentation, Rabia. It was interesting. I don't have any slides, so I guess you have to listen to me, what I have to say. But first, of course, it's my own views. It's not the views of the IMF. So just gonna summarize kind of what we've been doing for quite some time. I mean, Safa, you mentioned the book we kind of published in 2016 with Rida Sharif and Minju. IMF book on diversification, starting with kind of GCC countries, but then also giving some other examples across the world, and kind of some kind of empirical and theoretical background to diversifying. I guess another resource would be, and I'm going to talk about it shortly, the work we've done with Rida Sharif as well, and former student of mine at Georgetown, Aditya Pandey, on writing the energy transition and kind of looking at the implications of the uptake of the EVs or electric vehicles and the implications on the oil market, kind of in the long run. So, and this work, it bears some implications on the climate change, actually bears quite a lot. We haven't gone into the implications in the paper, but maybe I'll mention some of them. So in the paper, so let me start with this one, and it relates to this whole climate transition. And in a way, what is important, I mean, transport accounts for quite a big share of total emissions, I guess about 15 to 20%, right? Globally, in some countries, probably even more, depending on how much it's driven, you know, consumption of oil and gasoline and so on. And what we did, we said, well, let's look at these past transitions, technological transitions, and especially the transition in the early 20th century when the horse was displaced by actually motor vehicles, right? Electric cars actually started coming about at the same time, but then with the discovery of oil and of course the oil companies and so on, and I guess Henry Ford's production line, they really overtook the electric cars, became much cheaper and easier to produce. So I guess we're kind of coming back to that, 100-year scenario ago, 100-year-old scenario where we're trying now to displace motor vehicles with electric cars. And we looked at how fast the horses were displaced, and adopted this scenario to how fast the motor vehicles will be displaced going forward. And kind of alternative scenario was kind of the adoption of motor vehicles, which was a bit slower than the displacement of horses. And it gave us a range of projections of how cars will be displaced going forward. And we had to make certain assumptions on developing countries. Although now, when we wrote this paper about 6 years ago, people were saying that, well, developing countries will still be kind of running on gasoline cars. But actually now looking at China and India, it's probably gonna go even faster than many thought just a couple of years ago. And when you look at this, actually the implications on the oil market are huge. The motor vehicles essentially would be displaced, under this kind of fast paced scenario. by 2040, right? I mean, almost more than 90% of the cars will be displaced by 2040. And then in another scenario, it's closer to about 50, 60%. So, which still amounts to quite a few cars, kind of gasoline cars. Now that, that's just projection. I think, from what we see so far, the numbers, the uptake of electric vehicles is pretty fast. So it's going even faster than what we think. And given that most of the developing countries, especially the two big ones like China and India, if the penetration is fast enough, I think and the production of old cars stops, I think the uptake of electric vehicles will be even faster. Now, it doesn't mean that we should kind of rely on the market forces. Definitely there is room for policy to expedite it, given especially the implications, right? You don't want to, rely on the market in this case, because if we are wrong, the implications are catastrophic, right? So in that sense, you want to err on the side where you actually push too much, maybe, and you make this happen earlier. But it has trade-offs, right? Especially for oil exporters, especially for oil-producing nations, right? But it's definitely of benefit to oil importers and many other social benefits that Rabia mentioned that goes beyond just simple GDP. Right now, the penetration is happening even faster because the hurdles to adopting electric vehicles are actually declining even faster than when we wrote the paper years ago, and especially in terms of cost. The big part of the cost is really the batteries, and the cost of batteries has been declining really fast. And of course, there's always this discussion, and we did some kind of analysis in the paper about, it's not going to reduce emissions much, even if you adopt electric vehicles, largely due to, demand for electricity will go up. But demand for electricity in many countries is not just coal. I mean, and especially now that renewables is taking over, and the cost of renewables is even cheaper than even than in some cases natural gas. This issue becomes mute. And even if you have to, we did this experiment in the paper calculation, even if you had to power all this extra demand for electric vehicles with oil and so on, you're still going to save on the demand for oil, because it's just electric cars are much more efficient in terms of kind of equivalent miles per gallon type driving. So these issues are disappearing fast, and the cost is coming down fast. And especially if you look at lifetime cost, because electric vehicles are easy to maintain, it's much cheaper, you don't need to worry about gas and so on. The prices of those, it becomes even cheap, even in terms of lifetime cost, even probably today. And I think there are different estimates here. Some people report say it's today, some say maybe in the next couple of years or so. Now, so electric vehicles is important. I mean, and I think there is a room for policy here as well. Another side to this is renewables, and the cost of it has come down also substantially. And, it helps powering the extra demand for electricity that will come from electric vehicles. So once you combine these two, you solve a huge chunk actually of the climate change issues, challenges that we face today in terms of emissions, right? And then of course you have to worry about some other components, which is industry, which is not trivial, and then maybe some energy efficiency issues related to buildings and so on. But even on industry side, you have a lot of advancement now in technologies of how you deal with steel production and cement production, and even agro, in terms of agricultural production. So there are, I think, technologies are on the way now to expedite them. That's where you need policy, so the cost comes down faster. And then of course the deployment, and that's where all the investment will also come in, creating all these opportunities for most. But so we also have to think, I guess, also on the other side of the question, right, which is the oil producers, which rely to a large extent on exports of oil, And in our paper on electric vehicles, we argue that, look, even if the demand doesn't fall substantially for oil, but as oil loses what we kind of call monopoly power on transportation, then it essentially will have to compete with all other energy sources, for different energy uses. Because you cannot use coal to drive cars, but you can use many different sources to power electricity or heat. And once oil loses that, essentially, it becomes very, available, even if it's not in huge supply, the price most likely will collapse substantially. And that's where the problem will come in. So it's not necessarily disappearance of oil per se, it's more about really the price of oil collapsing. And I think our prediction was that it essentially would collapse, roughly to the prices of other energy sources like coal. So in equivalent levels, it's about $15 per barrel, roughly, I think we looked at 2015 prices, but hasn't changed much since then. So by 2040 and so on, right? So by the time this demand for oil collapses due to the electric vehicles, the oil price will collapse substantially. And that's really the biggest impact on oil producers, the decline in export revenues and of course, fiscal revenues. And that's where this whole diversification story comes in. We had to do a lot of persuasion, when we discussed with authorities in oil producing countries, including GCC, on kind of why we want to diversify. And this discussion was, it's not a new discussion. But oil prices were pretty high in the mid, 2010s, 2012, 13, and even 14. And it took us a while to persuade them that diversification is important because oil prices will collapse. But even if they don't collapse, I think there is even bigger reason, the productivity gains that many oil exporters have seen over the past decades have been pretty much negligible or even negative, right? It's just the production and productivity, non-oil production of kind of non-oil economy and productivity gains haven't really seen much. Right? A lot of spillovers from the kind of oil revenues went into non-tradable sectors, and you don't have much productivity gains there. So what is important is really export diversification, and that export diversification also requires state intervention, because we've seen in many oil exporting countries, relying kind of on the market forces to a large extent, and many companies go toward non-tradables production and other types of production, which is not risky. And going into this kind of non-oil exportables or non-oil type of production, tradables, is much riskier. And in that sense, you need some sort of state intervention, or however you want to call it, industrial policy or any other type of policy. And what is important is to have this goal of dynamic export sector, right? You create this dynamic export sector, and in a sense, this drive toward renewable, toward electric vehicles, and so on, is a natural hedge for many of these oil exporters, because as they lose their oil revenues, they're hedging it through other types of energy production, whether it's renewables, whether it's electric vehicles or anything else related to this bigger energy sector, right? And we see it already in many oil companies have been doing this with offshore farms and so on, where actually the expertise, oil company expertise comes handy, dealing with offshore wind farms, even onshore wind farms and other types of renewables. And there's a lot of stuff that can be done here. It's not just solar panels or turbines. There's this whole supply chain, there is whole installation, the kind of end consumer, and so on. And we just saw it in the presentation earlier. So it creates this natural hedge toward moving toward this. And you don't want to wait until later, because the trend, I think, is accelerating, and we may not even underestimate, but I think it's more visible now that the trend in terms of how we're moving toward renewables and electric vehicles is accelerating. And it's also makes sense because the costs have come down so much. So if we think about this diversification, the three principles that we argue that are important kind of to diversifying the economy, it's another paper we did, I think 2019 on industrial policy, and essentially it's kind of moving toward the sophisticated industries, especially for the GCC countries, which are rich countries in general, even in per capita terms, and so you cannot really go into industries that are, say, labor intensive and don't command higher wages. So you want to go to more kind of more sophisticated, higher wage sectors. And for this, it's really about kind of high productivity and sophisticated sectors, which require a lot of high-tech manufacturing of different sorts. So a lot of renewable related industries might actually fit into this, right? And so this movement towards sophistication is important. The competition is actually very important because you are not sure which firms will make it. So it's really not supporting firms, it's supporting the industry. And of course, exports, because it creates completely different incentives to improve, to compete, and also gives you economies of scale, especially for many smaller countries, right? And GCC countries are kind of, we can think of them as small open economies. Now, to do so, you need to create the right incentives, right, for firms, for workers, and I guess, I think when we did this conference in Kuwait in 2014 on diversification, oil prices were more than $100 a barrel. And, still people were interested in why we wanted to diversify. And, the book came out from this conference 2 years later. And we also had kind of staff discussion notes that came out related to GCC at that time. I think also around 2015, 2016, where we went a little bit into details of what GCC countries could do. And this incentive change is very important. So you want to kind of steer workers toward the industries that are kind of dynamic exports oriented, and especially firms toward those industries, because most firms are kind of in this non-tradable construction type of sectors, right? Or if they're in tradable sectors, they're more in sectors like tourism. Some may be in sectors like finance, logistics, but these are very capital intensive or do not employ a lot of labor. So if you're also thinking from the employment perspective, they don't give you a huge kind of boost for labor demand, especially if you have a lot of young people going into the labor market. So this is really important. And then there are many ways, we can probably discuss it in our Q&A session. What can countries do to steer the firms and workers toward those sectors? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hassanov. Now we'll move to the questions. Just to start off, I have a question for Dr. Farouqi. So the GCC seems like a very interesting case because first it has very high solar power potential. The solar energy supply is positively correlated to the energy demand, contrary to Western Europe, because cooling is a big part of the energy demand and comes with the sun. And the GCC countries have a very cost competitive solar market right now. I think about the last auction was almost 1 cent per kilowatt hour, which is really, really low, like lower than oil, almost lower than gas, domestic gas. And at the same time, the GCC countries are trying to reduce their domestic demand and consumption so that they can keep their oil and gas for export. So given this setting, it seems very strange that the renewable energy capacity now is only about 1% of total capacity in the region. So I was wondering if you could speak on this and on the barriers that have existed for the expansion of renewable energy in the region.
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. Indeed, I think there is a relatively conducive environment for renewable energy in the UAE. They were speaking about the UAE, because, and we've seen spectacular low costs in auctions for solar. There is currently a 2 gigawatt capacity solar farm being constructed in tranches, of course, in Dubai. There are other projects in the region. I can send you a very nice slide with all the projects in the region and the GCC, which is very interesting. We keep track of all the projects and at which stage they are in terms of announcement, planning, implementation, etc. So there is a conducive environment in terms of the regulator here, the sort of security or how shall I say, the confidence that investors have in bringing investments to the countries. Some nice conditions as well to implement projects here. And then the auctions were very well designed. So they were designed in a way that it brought a lot of competitors to the region, and this is how they got such a nice bid. Why it's still very low, I don't remember the percentage. It is relatively low, yes, from capacity. I mean, I think the country is doing pretty well compared to the resource endowment it has. I think you could claim it could go faster. I think the strategy for diversification of the energy sector is the real one in terms of trying to move away from fossil fuel dependency, complete fossil fuel dependency. But it's here, and that's what I was mentioning in the presentation. You have existing conditions, you have a structure of energy market that is here, you have regulation that moves more or less at a fast pace, and all these aspects are such that you might not be, having a share of renewables that is quite in any ways spectacular. But given the plans, and if you take all the plans for the next few years, I think solar in any case will be a relatively important share of the market. And I think that in that sense, the UAE is probably doing the best in the region as far as renewables are concerned.
Thank you so much. Yes, it's very. I was reading that the UAE was 69% of the whole country, like the whole region's solar power capacity. That's a lot.
Yeah, it's a lot, but it's not a lot from the total. So the percentage seems quite spectacular, but it's not from a huge amount. But maybe Fuad, thank you so much for your presentation. It was really very interesting for me. Maybe he can add something in terms of the diversification strategy of the UAE.
Yes, please.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't looked at it in recent years. I mean, I used to work on GCC, years ago. But in general, there is, I think, this drive toward understanding and drive toward diversifying away from fossil fuels, and of course there is this climate aspect there, right? And this whole, putting solar panels together and moving toward renewable energy, that would help, right, for sure. But there is also another aspect to this, and I think it's also quite important. And I'm not sure where the countries are on, at least in GCC, what they're doing in that respect. It's kind of the production side of it too. So whether the countries are in terms of diversifying away from oil, they're thinking about renewables being part of their. I think it's there in the visions of the countries. The question is, exactly what, right? So producing solar panels might work, but it may not, because it's relatively cheap nowadays, mostly done in labor-intensive, kind of low-wage countries. So the question is it feasible to do it in the GCC. But there are many other things that can be done, on the higher end of these more high-tech type of manufacturing, more research-oriented, which also requires time to do and to create. But this is something to look into. And there are also huge supply chain element there that could be done. And it's not just solar panels, there is whole wind, and then there is whole electric vehicles, design, kind of production of batteries, different components of cars, and so many other things that could be done. And there's whole kind of electrification of many things, of industries. So there's a lot of things that could be thought about within this bigger kind of diversification drive toward kind of green energy, let's say.
Thank you. I actually had a question about what you were saying earlier about really investing and going for high-end manufacturing and tradables. And given that those tend to be very energy intensive industries, how can we, kind of design a move away from services, which is what, for example, Dubai is going for, like the services part, and moving towards high-end manufacturing, but at the same time, while having ambitious emission abatement strategies or policies. So how can we grapple between those two objectives?
Yeah, I think, moving toward high-end manufacturing, I mean, it's also, it's not easy, but at the same time, what is the alternative? So at the end of the day, going into labor-intensive in GCC becomes a bit harder, because the idea is, at the end of the day, is to think about employment, right? So if you want to employ GCC citizens, right, which are to a large extent working in high-paying jobs, mostly public sector jobs, how do you create these opportunities outside of the public sector, where many of the GCC citizens would work? And in that sense, you have to think about these high-end, high productivity industries, which are also geared toward exports, right? Because you need the economies of scale, you need incentives, you need the right market signals. So there is a lot of discussion about services in that regard, but they are not employing too many people. But you can also think about services related to the green energy, climate change industries as well. There's a lot of IT related stuff. There's a lot of research and development and scientific type of consulting services that would be related to this. So you have opportunities there as well. But for bigger countries, like say Saudi Arabia, where you need to employ many millions of people, services may not be sufficient, right? You may have to have some sort of manufacturing facilities as well. And the question really becomes now, what kind of facilities, what kind of industries related to this climate change industries? And it's not an easy question to answer. You have to think about what you want to produce, whether it's related to electric vehicles, whether it's related to certain industries, maybe better production of petrochems, and there are a lot of things, that's actually another issue to think about, plastics and so on, that the demand for that may also be declining, especially given this whole drive for reducing plastics in the world. So I think at the end, it's the issue of the, trying to figure out what could be done, and then thinking about it, how to bring local firms, local workers, but also foreign direct investment, maybe some partnerships with foreign companies, and then trying to kind of advance the industry. And given that now the global value chains are so scattered, it's not scattered completely, but they're in 3 major Asia, Europe, and North America hubs, and you can always start thinking about production of certain components as part of global value chains as well. It doesn't have to be the whole good, final good, or the whole value chain domestically.
Okay. If I can just link this to just a question for two of you, because you were mentioning Saudi, and reading, for example, the Saudi national vision of 2030, they mentioned really localizing manufacturing, for example, for parts needed for desalination plants, for solar panels and aircrafts. And reading this, I was just wondering whether the infrastructure and the human capital was there to have this kind of localization. And I was just wondering what you thought about this.
Okay. I mean, it's, I guess, the desalination plants, that's another industry, right? To think, we should also, make it a bit easier in terms of the kind of gas, emissions and so on. But the issue becomes, it's very capital intensive too. So if I had to think about, where my labor would go, especially as I have a lot of young people coming into the labor force, what are they going to do? You have to also think about diversifying, not just away from fossil fuels or oil, right? You want to also think about diversifying into many industries, especially if you're a big country, right? Like Saudi Arabia. So you have to think about, different types of industries I can go into that will employ my population, right? And desalination plants and kind of, I don't know how many people they employ, but I'm sure it's pretty capital intensive. I mean, airspace industry might be more attractive in that sense. Auto industry might be more attractive. Of course, they employ less people than they used to. It's also relatively capital intensive, but they still employ a lot of high tech and high wage workers. And in that sense, it helps. And the good part about it is it's high wage, but you don't necessarily need to have a master's or PhD. Many of these workers can be trained on the spot, and they train to operate machinery and so on. And in that sense, these training institutes of this vocational training of doing this other type of jobs that are not necessarily research or development, then it creates opportunities for a bigger chunk of the population as well.
Dr. Farouki, would you like to add something?
Yeah, just maybe a point that I find interesting always when thinking about creating value along the segments of the value chain. I think there are nice examples of some countries who have done it at the national level. As Fuad mentioned, sometimes your market is too small, or you might not have certain capacities, but I think there is a lot to be said about a sub-regional sort of cooperation at that level. Unfortunately, of course, there are also political aspects, etc. But beyond those, if you can think of, let's say, a GCC market or a North African market, where localization happens at that level, basically leveraging on the capabilities of any one of these countries. Together, I think there is a lot there that we need to think about and further push in order to try to build on those supply chains that Fuad was mentioning. Where we saw during the COVID period the difficulty, the disruption of the global supply chains. Historically, we've also seen that very few countries really develop without some form of industrial base. So that's why when Fuad mentions industrial policy, it's essential. So as a result of that, I think even when you think of a country, when you're speaking about Saudi Arabia, what can they do? UAE, Saudi Arabia is big enough, but UAE, small country, Kuwait, small country. But maybe together, there's really a lot they can leverage on in order to create supply chains that really are at proximity, and where each of the countries then can further develop other kind of industries and create value domestically through these sub-regional cooperation.
Very interesting. Just a follow-up question on this, actually, because the GCC countries have been trying to really push regional trade, for example, with the free trade area. But I was reading, for example, in the report that you wrote with Rida Sharif, that you were saying that there was very little complementarity between different countries in the region. And so, like, maybe you could maybe speak on this, whether that changed, and if not, like how to move away from that and move towards complementarity.
Yes, yeah, important issue. I mean, in a way, I guess what we meant was that most countries are still oil exporters, including the Arab Emirates, right? As a country, it's still mostly oil exporter. So, you know, even if you have free trade agreement, what you're going to really trade with each other? No, there is not really much to trade because not much is being produced. So what is important is, you know, the production. I think Rabia mentioned a very important point. As small countries, you may not be able to do it by yourself, but the regional cooperation where you kind of decide on a bigger industry that has relatively high costs, you know, like auto or aerospace, and where you get together and you decide, you know, how we can, in a way, plug ourselves into this global value chain and do it regionally. You know, in a way, that's what Airbus did, you know, in the European Union. You know, you have different production done in different parts of the EU, Spain, UK, Germany, and so on. So this can be done also in the GCC area, you know, and especially for small countries, this regional cooperation becomes important in terms of production. So before you go to the trade part, I mean, I think it's yeah, there's not much tariffs, there's not much, you know, the regulations are relatively minor, you know, taxation regime is relatively mild. So all of these things, kind of the business environment is already there, you know, it's easier to trade, but the production part is missing, and that's really what is needed. And I think what is important, and we saw it, Rabia mentioned it, you know, now going through this pandemic times, you know, the industrial base, especially in the pharma, right? If you think about it, it's only concentrated in a few countries. So the vaccine production, you know, we're talking about waiting for the vaccines. Well, you know, it's being produced at, well, if whatever the private sector will produce. So if you wait for other countries to produce it and then you import it, you know, you may be waiting for quite some time, right? And that's really the issue nowadays for many developing countries. You know, they're waiting for the vaccines because it's not produced enough. And that's where also you have to think about, maybe it's an opportunity as well, which, you know, say you do rapid testing, right? Well, you know, vaccine production is a bit harder, but still possible within few months. I think that's what the UK did. They built facilities last year when they got ready for the vaccine production. Well, they have the facilities and they're producing and vaccinating their population fast enough. So you know, if you're a small country, maybe you'll be able to import it, but bigger country, well, it's a bit harder, and you need to have the industrial base, maybe for pharma, medical goods, and other things. And we saw the importance of this.
Thank you so much. I think I'll move back to the carbon intensity part and renewable energies. So if we look at carbon capture and storage, CCS often like features in most of the NDCs, nationally determined contributions of the GCC, apart from Kuwait and Oman. And I was just wondering what you thought about this, given that it's currently very expensive and not at scale, and whether you thought that this was just a move to divert away from the need to phase out oil production. So yeah.
So CCS is not a GCC specific issue. It's everywhere. If you look at any energy transition pathway towards this cleaner future, it's very interesting because you have, and again, this is personal. I'm not representing the Irina's vision here. What is very interesting is you have, let's say 2050, we want net zero with a 1.5 degree pathway. This is our energy demand. And let's do everything possible to, supply that demand. So you have two issues. One is energy demand. I mean, we could think of curbing energy demand, for example. We could think of a better distribution. We always speak about economics as being production, consumption, and distribution. Most of the time we speak about production, a bit about consumption, not at all about distribution. So if we're talking about climate change, we might think about historical responsibility. And maybe some countries need to cap their growth or curb their growth, let's say, and distribute differently. So one problem is energy demand. The second problem is, since you are pushing to have that energy demand with all sorts of possibility, and you've done as much as you can with electrification of end users, you've done as much as you can with electricity produced from renewables, and then you continue to try, and it doesn't work, right, to meet it. So you start to go into negative emissions, right? So you want CCS, you want to capture the carbon, and there's a CCS. There is now a big hype about BECCS for bioenergy, and so you start, that's how your energy basically is, or the climate objective is met, because you can't meet it with the rest. It's not enough. So CCS, as you said, it's for the moment, not at scale. It's not commercial, and we don't have it as a solution. So we have in our own energy pathway a little bit of CCS for industry, and now a little bit of bioenergy CCS. What can I tell you? I think we're creating a depth to our environment, and I don't know how we're going to pay it. So I mean, I won't be here, but I care about future generation like yours. So that's my own perspective on it. Yeah, I don't think it's really a solution.
Dr. Hasnaf, do you want to add something?
Yes, yeah, I echo Rabia's view. No, I mean, it might be complicated, expensive. It doesn't mean that it won't work, say, down the line, or 5-10 years down the line. I mean, you have to do some research on that and try to improve it, to make it cheaper. And then, of course, the cost components usually about adoption and how fast it's adopted, and economies of scale and things of this sort. But before you kind of get more kind of complicated ways of solving the climate crisis, no, maybe we should start doing it from much easier ones. And the easier ones, which are already available and already cheap, like renewables and electric cars. And it's going to take you all the way to quite a big chunk of, where you get rid of emissions to a large extent. Within, probably within 10 years, you can achieve a lot just by focusing on this and kind of supporting. Maybe you don't want to put all your eggs in one basket, and at the same time, you try to figure out other ways of how you can approach it. But why not starting with that? And for this, of course, you cannot rely on just market forces because it's costly to switch technologies, right? And you need to have incentives and regulation and so on. If you do that, and then you have to think about how you compensate the losers. What do you do? I mean, this becomes a very important issue, right? I mean, there's a lot of discussion about carbon pricing and hiking taxes, but we know it's not easy to do politically too, right? So maybe there are other ways to think about how we can switch kind of the technology use from fossil fuels toward renewables and electric cars. And the technologies are here. It's cheap. We should focus more on that, and then think about also and do research and spend money on R&D related to these other ways.
Okay. Taking your word, I'll move maybe to policies. So as you mentioned, Dr. Farouki, the GCC countries have mostly just gone down the route of auctions and decided not to go for feed-in tariffs or premium tariffs or all the other policies that Western countries have favored in the past years, although there's a move now towards more auction-based. So do you think that there is a gap there in policy, and what could be done from the side of the governments to truly encourage this move towards renewable?
I'm going to answer very simply. There is no perfect policy, first of all. Auctions is in fashion for the past, I don't know, decade maybe, so 8, 9, mainly 5, let's say the last 5 years. We do a lot on auctions and auction design, and ensuring that when you do an auction, you really look at the trade-off between the deployment of renewables and your overall, let's say, development objectives, because sometimes there are. But feed-in tariffs have also shown their limits. Again, there is a huge debate in the EU right now, to which we are participating, which are the feed-in tariffs, proponents, and against the auctions proponents. I don't want to look at policy like that. For me, I think it depends on country conditions, on what is your ultimate objectives, on the kind of technology you want to deploy, on the scale of that technology. Sometimes feed-in tariffs for certain technologies at smaller scale really make sense. Sometimes at larger scale, maybe not always. We have seen certain drawbacks from auctions. I mean, shortcomings from auctions. You tend to lose small players in the game because they cannot afford to do it. So I don't want to be pro or against a certain measure. I think it really depends on what it is that you're trying to, what objective you're aiming for. But the one thing I would say is that you always need to ensure that you address those trade-offs that you have with any policy in terms of what your objective is with that particular objective for renewable energy deployment. Let's say it could be for other aspects of the transition, but vis-a-vis the objective, the development objective that you have as a country. So I think that's what I would keep it at.
Thank you. Always trade-offs. Such a complicated world. So Dr. Hassanov, would you like to add something?
I mean, yeah, I'm not familiar with the details, of course, of the whole trade credits and auctions and so on. But one important point is that you don't want to rely on just one policy as well, right? It's really a menu of options that you try, given that the situation, it's not trivial. No, we already see the implications of the climate change today with changing temperature patterns and natural disasters and so on. And it's just going to get worse, most likely, down the line, right? I mean, 1 year may be okay, but then it may get much worse later. So you want to try all these different options. And in a way, you can try it through taxation, you can try it through, allowing, basically, emissions trading and so on, but eventually, you have to reduce the emissions, and you have to kind of think about what is really causing emissions and how you can reduce it, right? And at the end of the day, the regulation and kind of could be also important. How did they make sure that cars became more energy efficient. It was basically by regulation. You have to do so much by certain time, and this also probably can be done today. There's one example, I think, in the Emirates. EPFL, the Swiss university, the Polytechnique in Lausanne, they have a campus in one of the Emirates in UAE, and I think they've came up with kind of energy efficient building requirements, reducing the consumption of energy by like 30% or so, right? They've tried it, it worked, and I mean, you do start doing things of this sort, especially if it's becoming widespread, then you start seeing the implications, right? So you have to look at each of these emitting sector and then see what you can do, how can you improve, and then you need definitely policy to guide the private sector and households toward doing so.
Thank you. I just had a last question from myself. So you were in your book, you were talking about how first the public sector is so important that it's restricting the kind of the incentives for the private sector, and the oil sector is also restricting the non-oil sector, what you call the Dutch disease. And so I was wondering from a more social and political perspective, because you said that one of the way would be to restrict public employment. Do you think this is feasible given the social contract in the region? And do you have any other suggestion on that side?
It's a tough question, Safa. I mean, I don't think there is much choice, right? I think it's just a matter of time. No, you can disagree on the timing when the oil price collapses, right? We can all argue when it will exactly happen. But if it happens sooner than later, let's say, we said in the 2030s, by 2040, but now, I mean, it can even happen within the next 10 years, right? If this move toward the electric cars and new renewables intensifies, then you have 10 years essentially to figure out what to do, because most of the economy is so much oil dependent one way or another. And if you have to basically, in the next 10 years, get to some point where most of your population can work in many industries, well, you have to do it now, right? And diversifying into renewables, related industries is one. Thinking about how to move workers, especially the ones that are incoming to the labor market, away from public sector toward private sector, right? There will be some attrition for sure down the line, but what do you do with many young workers, for example, right? Where do they go? And for this, you need industries, other types of industries, whether it's manufacturing, services, different types. If you are a bigger country, you have to do it basically now. I don't think you have much choice really. And how you do it, I mean, you can think about incentives. No, I mean, I think there are already some incentives in the GCC countries. No, when they give you maybe a couple of years leave, on reduced salary, and you go work in the private sector. They, set up different kind of agencies to provide loans for businesses and so on. But you have to think a little bit beyond that as well. Most of these, if you look at the numbers, most of these again become non-tradable businesses, right? And you have to think about the tradable businesses. How do you create even a small firm, that can export and can grow big, so you can hire people? And that's really where if you look at the employment across, many countries, that's really what drives kind of employment. It's the small firms becoming big, young firms becoming big in these industries, and then they can hire a lot of people, and then you end up with high growth, high productivity, and all the resulting benefits. Right? So you have to think about not just on the worker side, kind of improving skills through different means, training and so on, but also on the firm side. How do you make firms enter the new industries, and also existing conglomerates, instead of doing construction and non-tradables, moving toward exportables as well, right? And I think it's just a matter of time before the oil prices fall. And if you are prepared, the more prepared you are, the better you'll be.
Okay. Just on non-tradable, an audience member is asking, what do you think about diversifying the passion of the economy from resources to a knowledge economy? So earlier you were talking about pharmaceuticals, but also R&D. Do you think this could be a base to drive the economy?
I mean, knowledge-based economies, of course, we're talking about, but most of the knowledge-based economies employ, college and above, right? To a large extent, maybe even masters and above, right? In fields that would require a lot of skills, and research, kind of scientific services and things of the sort. So it's not, it helps, but the implications for the population at large is not clear, in terms of how much spillover you're going to get if you just kind of focus on this type. Now, if you start looking a little bit beyond simple kind of research and development, which may not employ too many people, but more toward production side, manufacturing, maybe something, and then you start talking about even larger number of people, which you may not need to have even probably college degree. You may even have some sort of training, and that would work, like many manufacturing workers, right? And then, of course, you have, if you have enough productivity gains in the economy, that would spill over and create all these non-tradable activities, that many GCC countries already have anyway, entertainment, restaurants, and so on. But these are non-tradables, and they would gear toward all the tradables, especially as the oil revenues start to decline, right? You need to compensate it with something else, and it has to be export-oriented. Otherwise, even big countries cannot be self-sufficient in everything. So you have to create enough exports to be able to maintain high standards of living.
Dr. Faruqi, would you like to add something on this?
No, I completely agree with Fuad, and just to say that as far as renewables are concerned, there is, I think, a strong developmental case there to integrate the renewable energy technology value chain. And so in that sense, there is a window of opportunity to combine energy transition and industrial development that, of course, the GCC has as objective as well, and especially for countries that have, as Fuad mentioned, are fossil fuel dependent economies and at risk of having stranded assets very, very quickly. So I think there's definitely, of course, Fuad is mentioning production and manufacturing overall, but as I think renewables is definitely part of that overall contribution to diversification of such economies.
Thank you. And just a second question from our audience before we close off the event. The audience member is asking, what kind of incentives should be set on the private sector, but also on individuals to encourage them to move to a more sustainable future?
Well, I'm sure we can talk about it for like another hour, I'm sure, probably. But, there's a lot of talk, of course, on what can be done in terms of, people maybe should eat less meat and so on. I mean, I think these are, great initiatives, but at the end, it's not that easy to change, the behavior. And by the time you change it, maybe way too late. So there are ways to solve actually a lot of these, issues related to that, and technology is already there in agri-business of how to capture these methane emissions and so on. So I think there is more on that front that could be useful. And energy efficiency, I think, so building regulations probably is going to be important. So you can try to do it from the consumer side to some extent, but I think if you do it from the producer side, you may get a bit stronger response. because there are only so many producers that you have to work with, and coordination is a bit easier to accomplish now. And if you have the right building regulations, more energy efficiency, you really push on the renewables, you really push on electric vehicles through different, tax incentives or just direct grants or anything, right? And also the production stuff. I mean, I think China started producing this $4,500 electric vehicle, and actually overtaking Tesla 3 now in China. So you can start thinking about different options of these key sectors where you can push on the regulatory side. I think beyond taxation and beyond kind of auctions and trade credits and I mean these emission credits and markets and so on, that I think can accomplish a lot. On the consumption side, I think its coordination problem is much bigger, because you need to get a lot of consumers to cut production of meat, which is probably harder to do.
Dr. Ferrohi?
Yeah, I mean, markets definitely cannot resolve all these things. So I think, I have nothing to add in terms of the production side. I think on the consumer side, the Fouad has summarized it well. I think on the consumer side, we will see more and more need for behavioral change. Now, how that is going to be, I'm not a specialist in that at all. So how this is going to be implemented, I have no idea, but I'm really hoping that the COVID crisis has put some sense in people's mind, and that we will hopefully learn from this experience. We don't always do, but this has been, I think, such a tragedy, I think, for unexpected one, that I hope that part of this behavioral change will just be there. But I do believe that this is going to be extremely important from the consumer side. We absolutely need to consume differently, not only produce, but consume differently. And then there's all these distributional issues that go with it. But definitely, I think that that part is some part of the equation that is extremely important to take into account.
If I may add to Rabia's point, I think one issue that related to distribution and consumer change, right? The urban planning, I think, is also important, right? I think there is creates jobs because it's a public infrastructure and investment. And I think this is important, how you design cities. It goes beyond simple building requirements, because if you don't want people to drive, at least you provide public transportation on renewable buses and so on, beyond just electric cars and so on. So I think it's another important element here.
Thank you. Urban planning is fascinating, just my own opinion. Just before we close off the event, thank you everyone for joining us. Next week we have another event on climate again. It's going to be on Monday, 8th March at 7 p.m. UK time on a green economy, a prospect of a low carbon future with Professor Robert Pauling, Professor of Economics at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, and founding co-director of its Political Economy Research Institute. So we hope to see you there as well. And